we're in this extraordinary moment where, for example, DeSci and the community and what it's building, it is truly kind of a if not multi-generational moment for how those mechanisms for aligning to community needs and channeling these new tools and the productivity gains that they have, aligning that with those communities is just an unbelievably exciting moment. Just making that reality happen is now the key, essentially, to execute and apply and learn and make it reality, essentially.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the DeSci Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Martin Karlsson. Martin is the CEO of Lateral, a research tool for scientists. More precisely, a web app that helps one read, find, share, and organize one's research in one place. In our conversation, we discuss potential ways to capture tacit knowledge, underappreciated ideas in DeSci, as well as the limits of outsourcing research and the need to ensure knowledge transfer across generations. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy our conversation. So, Martin, thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
First of all, could you maybe introduce what Lateral, your company, is doing and situate it in the broader DeSci context? What high-level problem is your field or your work actually trying to solve?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the highest level way to frame it is that what we really want to help people do is be able to coordinate together and share information to solve complex problems. And so the work that we do kind of falls into two buckets towards that, where one is that we have the Lateral app that you'll see if you go to lateral.io today, and that helps researchers find evidence much faster from PDFs, essentially. And then the second piece, which is what we're very excited about, which is kind of the next phase in the evolution, is that we're creating a coordination graph tool and network that lets you essentially turn that evidence gathering process into a multiplayer exercise. So it lets you set out together what goals you're trying to achieve and then aggregate all the evidence that helps inform that and make progress towards it.
Mm-hmm. What are like some pitfalls in the approach? Maybe what's like the strong case against maybe using like, as I understand it, a search tool to just like scan PDFs for evidence rather than having to consume it maybe all the way. How do you think, like, are you aware of any dangers and how do you think about resolving them?
Yeah, so I think this ties into a broader question, I think, which is how, when you're using tooling, how you do so responsibly and don't kind of use it as a shortcut. And so the way that I like to see this is that with these tools, what it's all about is that it gives you more time to work on the hard problems because it lets you aggregate that evidence and dive in deeper where you need to and not spend a huge amount of time just finding the source of that evidence itself. So I think that's very important to keep in mind when using these tools, so that it's not intended to be something that stops you from diving deeper on the topic, but rather something that gives you far more context to do so efficiently.
Got it. Okay. And so far, what have been some like surprising takeaways from building and running Lateral? Did you change your mind about anything so far?
Yeah, so I think we've been on quite an idiosyncratic journey. So we've been working on this problem for a while, to put it that way. And one of the reasons for that is probably the most interesting learning as well, is that really what it boils down to is less about technology and more about people. And that might be obvious to many people, but for me, I think the learning was really to see that understanding the incentives that we have built into our organizational structures and how we interact with each other was actually the key thing to figure out how to address so that you could help people use these tools productively. So I'd say that was the kind of the biggest takeaway for me throughout this journey.
Yeah. I find it really interesting because I hear a similar story from many startup founders where you thought it was all in the tech and then you built the product and you actually run into a lot more like people problems. Why do you think, if you have any theories as to why that is just like this tacit knowledge that is stumbled upon by everyone starting a startup again and again and again, and it's really just something that individually you're surprised by, but like collectively, like a lot of people have gone through this problem. Like why don't really make that more explicit right away?
Yeah, I think it's because so I mean, often you want to start like the old adage is that you want to start with a problem that you feel yourself that you're trying to solve and not that you're trying to shoehorn a technology into anything. And I think for us it was interesting because our challenge was almost that we were trying to solve kind of a fundamental societal problem in the sense, and it was kind of a very big problem in terms of how do you help humanity coordinate more efficiently. So that made it quite diffuse. So I think in our case, uh, specifically the path to that learning um, was I think part of it is that one of the things that helps you start early on is a certain level of naivety about kind of how difficult it's going to be. So maybe that's part of it is that it's the the willingness to tackle the problem somehow is because you're not too jaded at the beginning
Right,
because of
right.
and that jadedness is typically linked then often to having those challenges of how do you actually overcome the human element of resistance to new ideas and so on.
Yeah, yeah. What do you, maybe zoning out a little more onto the DeSci field as a whole? What's the strong case you would say for DeSci as a whole? Like, what was kind of the idea that got you hooked, working in this field in general, and also like building tools explicitly for DeSci, as I understand it?
Yeah, so I think that that actually dovetails really well to the first question, because the big thing for me when I kind of arrived in this space was A, the kind of underlying values in terms of giving greater agency to, the individual researcher and creating an environment where they can thrive. But B, and almost more importantly, was that here was a community that was deeply involved in looking at new incentive structures. Like, how do you correct the fundamental misaligned incentives at the core of why we're not realizing these solutions fast enough? We're not adopting these technologies well, and we're not communicating efficiently enough to communities of the potentials that are there. So I think that was really what stood out to me was like, here is the missing piece, tying it to the earlier question, where it's like there's if you look at this moment in history right now, it's kind of wild because we have this convergence of effectively having a very volatile situation for the planet and so many complex issues to address, and at the same time, new AI capabilities making possible just an incredible productivity increase for every individual. But what we need is a way to challenge and to channel and harness that to productive
Mhm,
ends. And that's what I think DeSci, as an example of all of those incentive capabilities being applied to science, really helps achieve essentially.
mhm. So, could you take me to like maybe a day, and I don't know how fast you think progress will go, but if we say there's like an adoption of the tools that you're, maybe most excited about or that you'd like to see in the world, like, 2 decades from now, like how will an individual researcher's life or maybe a research group's life has changed? Like what kind of tools or what kind of like processes will they go through, compared to nowadays? Maybe you could start there and like, extrapolate.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, to start now, I think the issue today is that there's quite a big gap between, for example, what communities would like to see happen for themselves across many different types of communities. So if you imagine like patient communities that want to see a medicine being developed for them in multiple different areas and so on, it can be quite difficult to find the path for how, as someone who is a layperson in that community, to actually have agency towards making that happen. And on the other side of that, you have researchers who have to navigate and then this is very often stated in DeSci, but they have to navigate very complex bureaucracies in order to get the funding that they need to pursue solutions that might be what these communities are looking for. So there's like a
Mhm,
fundamental, I think, like a very deep inefficiency and misalignment in how that process is handled today, which is arguably because the legacy systems that are used to coordinate it simply aren't quite up to the task of handling the complexity that we have today. So with that in mind, I think what's so exciting and the rate of progress I think could be just quite extraordinary because you now have, for example, DAOs being examples of communities coming together with shared goals, having ways to pool funding to realize those goals. And then when you combine that with AI empowered researchers who can then basically work towards finding those solutions more efficiently than ever, you are creating a far more efficient system where you then have goals that they can work towards and you have tooling that helps those people working towards it work even faster. And a core element of this, and this is one of the things we've been working a lot on, especially with organizations in the space are the coordination graph and information models that basically allows people to collaborate towards those goals efficiently. And so that mixture coming together, I think, means that there will be just an exponential acceleration towards making a lot of things that we've previously seen as impossible possible in terms of new medicines and new types of technologies. Um, so that the day what it becomes quite interesting is, depending on the rate of that increase, is that the day to day of a researcher or a scientist, I mean, 2 decades ahead, in the end, it might come down to effectively decision making and resource allocation, because the systems that you almost become like a conductor of these systems that can then aggregate evidence and run experiments and so on. So that really what it boils down to is, what future do we want to see? And I think that's where you'll have individuals involved in those networks who will be kind of help in conducting those orchestras, to put it that way.
Hmm. Yeah. Where are people right now maybe scared to go in DeSci, or like kind of prevent going? What are people maybe scared to work on? What's underexplored, you would say?
Yeah, so I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, framed in the context of DeSci, I think so. More broadly, from a societal perspective, obviously, like with seeing what's now possible in terms of, for example, these new AI capabilities, and what does that mean for the world, it raises a lot of questions. But I think what's exciting from the DeSci perspective is that I think it can give a lot of answers for how to responsibly make use of this and have, those voting mechanisms that are enabled in the space. Um, so I feel like, and the other interesting aspect is that DeSci also allows you to pursue those areas of science that historically have been underserved by kind of the old funding methods. So in a way, it's almost like it's almost difficult to say what DeSci is currently um, uh, holding back from pursuing, because it often is pursuing very much on the frontier of things. So I guess maybe the way I would frame the answer would probably be that it's more how to tackle the challenges of how to get alignment in this space, and what are ways, if you have an inherently decentralized framing, what are the how do we as a community enable some level of governance across that we have shared values around, and what's the best way to do that? That's probably the challenge that I'd say is there. But people are, I think, actively now trying to address that.
Yeah.
But maybe the scary bit can be that it's kind of the can sometimes be an elephant in the room, how to handle all these different opinions, to put it that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. If you've been following kind of that issue and how people are responding to it in the past, of like how do you actually, like govern a fundamentally decentralized system, what have been like some appealing to you answers, or like most promising kind of like, yeah, ways to address that?
Yeah, so I think trying to work towards a world where you have kind of a pluralistic view on these things as much as possible. So enabling multiple communities to coexist with different value mechanisms as well. Um, how you create an environment where you can share knowledge and share learnings as they come, but at the same time not need to all agree on the exact same way of doing things. I think that's really kind of a founding mindset that I think could be beneficial to enable kind of coexistence, without saying we all need to do this thing in this one way, because that then can quickly lead to recreating the old way, to put it that way. So I think structures that encourage pluralistic approaches are the ones that kind of stand out to me as being very interesting. And I mean, if you look at the work that Gitcoin, for example, has been doing in terms of quadratic funding, and like the evolution of those voting mechanisms, and how that can help ensure that resources are allocated across a plurality of projects and so on. Like, I think those are the ones that stand out to me as being kind of interesting solutions. Yeah, that's one avenue, I'd say.
Mhm. Mhm. Have there been like any pain points or inefficiencies of the research process itself that academics have revealed to you throughout building your products, that you weren't necessarily aware of? Like any problems within the academic research pipeline that you actually like kind of missed and are now aware of, maybe working on solving, etc.
Yeah, so I think one of the ones that really well stood out is kind of understanding the nuance of almost the organizational structure of research. Now, this obviously, like, if you work in a lab or within a faculty or research team, then you'll have different varieties of this, the kind of hierarchy of research. And I think one of the key things to solving the problem is to understand the mindset of all the different participants in that. Um, so even though we help, people read PDFs faster, the nuance in it is to understand the motivation behind that individual doing that task, and also understanding that there might be systemic kind of issues to even do they have the knowledge to even complete that task. So
Yeah.
what is the knowledge exchange between someone more senior who actually knows how to do that, and they've handed out that task to someone more junior, but they don't have time to actually teach them? So how do you give
Mm.
them tools to really understand the method as much as, whatever the tool is helping you do?
Mm.
So I think unpacking that and really understanding that deeply is key to understanding how you create the most kind of joyful experience for somebody to really resolve their core issues beyond the high level task of kind of finding evidence, to put it that way.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not quite sure how to frame this question, but I read something recently that was quite interesting that was essentially arguing for even if AI is, like capable of a lot of uh, human skills or capable of performing them better, faster, cheaper, whatever, we should still have a certain set of people that are performing or like learning these skills just so they don't go out of extinction in like the human just like toolkit. Um, do you have any thoughts on that? I'm asking you because uh, of what you alluded to and what your product is essentially like making a claim about of like you can actually automate a lot of like essentially brute work, like the kind of tiresome scientific labor that used to be necessary and now maybe looks redundant, but should we like how much of that should we keep essentially?
Yeah, so I think, and I think that ties back to this idea of having more time for the more important questions in a sense. So I think it's very important, and so one of the information models that we're integrating is called discourse graphs, and it was created by a professor called Joel Chan with support from Protocol Labs, and he's always emphasized that this information model is there so that, for example, you don't just go out and kind of find the end of every paper to reinforce your argument, but you
Mm,
actually dive in and see what was the methodology. Like, can we
mm,
even trust this output? And so I think that really kind of cleanly highlights that the it gives you more time to interrogate more in more detail by finding the faster path to get there. And in order to do that, you need people to be skilled in being critical of kind of what evidence they're being presented with and so on. So the tool is a way to really empower the individual. We're very big on like retaining human agency in these mechanisms. And it's really a tool to empower the individual to ask those questions so that you make faster progress rather than a world where you kind of align for outputting information. And this also ties into reproducibility and things like that because you really you raise the bar so that you really need to be outputting high quality work because these tools will make it easier for people with the skills to very quickly say, well, actually, this, I can't reproduce this, or this methodology falls short of what I would trust, and so on and so forth. So that's my way, I guess, of answering that the human remains extremely important to
mm.
have that critical eye. And it
Yeah,
might be that as the systems get better, it abstracts it to some degree, but you'll always want to have that audit trail and then be able to dive down to ask questions of things, basically.
yeah. And I guess like zooming out even further, besides just doing research per se, as in consuming papers, actually like being at the lab bench and like performing a lot of, I guess like physical, just like labor. Do you have any thoughts on how much of that we should retain? I guess that's where more like where my question was directed at. Like even if it's totally unnecessary to like know how to run experiments that now a robot can like do much faster. Should we still like retain some of that redundancy just so, like there is kind of a lineage where that knowledge is like actually passed down?
Yeah, so I think with in the physical domain, that's where we like just to caveat that that's a space where we work with groups who have more deep expertise of that space. But from my perspective on the higher level, I think there's an importance that we don't hand over agency to the degree that we lose an ability to understand what's going on. And so to the degree that you have workflows that at least mean that through your education, you have a level of understanding of what's happening in principle, I think that helps to ensure you have the skill set to interrogate what's happening.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, that what's quite interesting, a lot like how that manifests, whether, you have training spaces in digital twin environments, like there's so many ways that that could then be scaled as well so that it's more accessible as well. So it opens up new ways to also provide that education. But I do agree that we shouldn't just hand over all agency to the system and just hope that it works, basically.
Yeah. If you had double the amount of funding for Lateral right now, would you take it into like a qualitatively like different direction? Like, would you spin up new efforts, just do more of the same of what you're doing right now? How would an additional like double the amount of funding change what you're working on?
Yeah, so I think that to provide a somewhat meta answer, because we're working on coordination mechanisms, essentially what we're aiming to do now is to outline the roadmap as we see it for what we're aiming to do to help facilitate this coordination of research in such a way that you could effectively then deploy that capital via that map to then just accelerate progress. So in what we're working towards is really how you can, as much as possible, remove all the barriers to progress, where either that can be done via providing more funding so that more attention is paid to where there are gaps that need to be filled, or that people come in with their expertise, or that they amplify the work that's being done to their network. So in the end, it provides a structure to outline how those resources would be allocated most efficiently to then accelerate progress. So my aim would be to use the tooling to channel that to realize these capabilities even faster and make them better, essentially.
Got it. Between you and the people that you work with or close to, is there like a contentious theme or like topic that seems to repeat itself when you're debating about your problem, about your work?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a really fun, the fun question there is, I don't know if contentious is exactly the word, but one of the biggest challenges is jumping between the now and the future. And what I mean by that is that we build products where we have people signing up every day to complete lit reviews that very much are framed in the world of lit reviews today. And at the same time, we're building for this future. And that mental gymnastics of keeping in mind where we're heading while solving for the world. We have people who sign up to our app who are moving over from paper as their like operating model. So I think that's probably the contentious aspect of it, is probably how to balance those two pieces. But I do think it's a very healthy thing to have in mind, because it means that we're always grounded in the experience of the researcher today while working towards this future. But it can be challenging, because prioritization wise, it means that you are balancing those two in discussions with the team, basically.
Yeah. Maybe as like a slight tangent, do you ever see people actually also regress, so to speak, to paper from maybe using digital tools? Like, have you seen kind of the opposite way? And like, what's the reasoning for that? Because I'm such a person that I'm
Yeah,
generally really, really interested in, and whether you encounter that too in the work you're doing.
yeah, I mean, a lot of people, it's also with like task lists are another example of this, where it's like there's a million task apps, but a lot of people just prefer to default back to notebooks or post-its or whatever it might be they're using. And I think in the end, when people revert back to what has worked for them in past, I mean, often they have honed that method for themselves. So I think in the end, like it's on us as tool builders to ensure that we're providing enough value to truly provide an uplift to how they were doing things in the past. So in the end, if the finding is that actually the physical experience on paper is providing a better way of learning, then I think that that's often a kind of going back to the honed way that they have refined their process in the past, and so that can make sense. And yeah, the reason might simply be that gave them a better experience than even these tools. So that's kind of this threat, because yeah, maybe a more concise way to put it is that the threshold that someone has to overcome if they're building a new method is not only that the new method is better than the old one, but also that it's so much better than the old one being practiced by someone who has honed that over years.
Right,
And
right,
so
right.
that's
Yeah,
what I think it all boils down to.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
being said, I think now the new capabilities that are being enabled are just some next level kind of accelerations, to put it that way.
Mm. Yeah. Is there anything that over the years you have become more skeptical about in, say, the meta science rethinking field as a whole?
Um, I think the key thing for me now is that I feel like we have the opportunity to realize a lot of these capabilities. So um, what I would say that putting theory into practice is the thing that I'd be very like encouraging of us to all do now, because so the skeptical part of me would be that we maybe the right way to put it would be just that we now take the theory and we apply it. And while there is obviously very important continuing discussion of the theory, it's to avoid getting lost in the theory, and now making kind of and translating it into the real world, because that translation is a very hard thing, and often an underestimated element of how hard it is to do. So
Implementation details.
yeah. so so I think that's kind of in terms of what I don't know if I'd say like I don't know if I'd say exactly skeptical, but I'd be wary of not now putting these things into practice, basically.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. Is there like any other implicit knowledge in the field that you feel like generally holds true by every, but is not like explicitly stated? It has to be learned anew by everyone entering the field with no real reason. It's like another of these tacit knowledge questions. Is there like anything that you wish you would have known and feel like it's really unnecessary that you actually had to like stumble upon it a while later?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, having been in this space for like, I guess you could say, so we've been kind of on this journey for the past 10 years. So,
Okay.
and
Great
fundamentally,
person to
so,
ask. Yeah.
sorry?
Great person to ask then.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that, and the thing about it though is that like one of the hardest pieces of that journey has been that it has been at times where it's like when you glimpse what the future might look like, it can be very hard to explain, like having the vocabulary to actually articulate what you're trying to do, which often means that it can be quite challenging and daunting because you at times find yourself kind of floating alone in the future. Um, and so I think the kind of the it would have been great to have more of the vocabulary that I have today back then, so that I could more eloquently explain what we're actually trying to achieve. But at the same time, that I it's I haven't looked into how much of that vocabulary existed back then is another element. But overall, I think that journey of kind of finding the language to express what you're trying to do in a way that others can understand is one of the hardest elements of this type of work, essentially. For
Mm.
me anyway, that was one of the really hard things. And so that experience of when you meet others and they have a vocabulary and then you can learn that and extend your ability to articulate what you're trying to do is just an extremely rewarding journey. So I guess that to answer your question, it's I would have loved to have more of that vocabulary early on and have that kind of context framing. But at the same time, the journey of learning it is also part of kind of truly understanding it. So it's a double-edged thing to some degree of whether of how you get there.
Was it like mostly, I guess, coming up with new labels for new things that you were trying to do, like adopting metaphors to make others understand what you're really like? How did you find your language after all?
Yeah, so it took a very long time, and I think the 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 key thing was that now in this space where you have coordination mechanisms being discussed and kind of game theory principles and different types of incentive structures and governance structures and voting mechanisms and all of this. In the end, it was kind of opening up that vocabulary that helped to tease out this whole narrative of how we create these new societal constructs that allow us to make progress. Um, and so, in the end, there was a really interesting talk early on in where I was exposed to this space, like at Funding the Commons, where it was somebody who'd been working in unions for a very long time, and talking about the correlation between unions and DAOs and the principal overlap and so on. And so I think it's definitely interesting. There are definitely, it resonates towards different constructs from the past, but at the same time, reinventing them and finding new words for them is quite an important process so that you uh, remove the baggage of the past from those. Because, for example, if you were to call DAOs unions, it would very quickly reframe the construct, even though there are certain shared principles based on what this person was saying, for example. So, yeah, that's a slightly wordy way of answering a question about words. But I guess the point is that like the vocabulary along the way resonates with words from the past, but it's finding the right way to reinvigorate them or find new ways of stating those things so that it's not it instantly pigeonholed by your audience into some past framing. Um,
Right, right.
if that, yeah, if
No,
that
it makes
answers.
sense. Yeah. I mean, those terms like carry a historical like just like legacy with them. But I suppose the important thing then is probably like getting the balance right between uh discarding that and like freeing yourself from the historical shackles and also like learning from that history, right? If you are really so close to unions, like there's probably like things in the past of unions that you would really benefit from too. Which I guess raises another question. Have you like learned anything from those like distant cousins of like the past, as that was today?
Yeah, so because we spent quite a few years working with large enterprises, like huge organizations, there was huge, I think, massively relevant learnings from that process because in the end, those organizations shaped over time to help facilitate that group of people to complete tasks. And so I think the key learning in that sense was being in the front lines of trying to bring in new technologies into those environments. You learned a lot about why they exist, and then you can also have a more kind of nuanced opinion on whether that what role that play and what role should that play in the future. Like a good one to consider there is like we worked with organizations that are building like infrastructure that if it doesn't work, that could be a kind of life or death situation. And in those contexts, you should have certain elements to slow down things in terms of decision making, and make sure that it's aligned with the risk profile of that endeavor, which I think is a very important and important consideration in science as well. Of course, when considering those implications, so if you imagine the acceleration that you might have in finding new potential medicines, for example, the clinical trial phase is a different um, problem to consider relative to that research phase. And I think
Yeah,
the learning from those past experiences was just to say that sometimes there are things that are inefficient, but they're inefficient almost for a reason. They don't
yeah,
need to be necessarily that inefficient, but there's a kind of a delay effect to just make sure that hugely consequential decisions don't have adverse effects effectively.
correct. Yeah, yeah. Um, it's like just the idea I feel like of the Chesterton's fence, like, and you might just not understand why the fence is there, but that doesn't mean like you should tear it down before really having made sure,
Yeah,
you understand where it came from. Yeah.
yeah.
Can you think of any other important questions maybe last out that I haven't asked you today, like anything left unaddressed that you really like to get to?
Um, I think no, overall, I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it covered a lot of the key points. Um, I think the main element that I would highlight is that we maybe didn't touch on as much is that we're in this extraordinary moment where, for example, DeSci and the community and what it's building, it is truly kind of a if not multi-generational moment for how those mechanisms for aligning to community needs and channeling these new tools, and the productivity gains that they have, aligning that with those communities is just an unbelievably exciting moment. So I think the main thing I would emphasize is just to really take a lot of encouragement towards the because it's a big it's a big lift what we're trying to do to help kind of improve a lot of these elements, but there has never been a more opportune time to make that lift happen when you consider these technologies coming into play, like in terms of just the productivity gains for research and so on. You can just show such an amazing new way to do things. So I would just emphasize that in just making that reality happen is now the key, essentially, to execute and apply and learn, and make it reality, essentially.
Wonderful. Well, Martin, thanks so much for talking today.
Likewise, thank you.